the DC pilot got lost and landing, trying to ask for directions, crashed. Despite its disastrous beginnings, the airmail program facilitated the growth of many aspects of aviation. The 1925 Airmail Act was one example of this because it allowed the post office to contract private airlines to fly the mail. This helped to support new airlines, but it also was dangerous for the airlines because it was uncertain and contracts were very temporary, so it wasn't a good deal for the airlines, only for the post office. In 1926, another act, the Air Commerce Act, was signed. This created the Aeronautics branch of the Commerce Department, which is the first regulating body of aviation and the precursor to the FAA. Regulation was very important to the survival of aviation. The Binary Wagers Act of 1930 helped with this too. This act was helpful to supporting airlines and making the airmail contracts more fair and appealing. However, the act also encouraged mergers and favored larger airlines because they were more likely to survive. This eventually led to the air crisis of 1934. Smaller airlines made claims of corruption and monopoly, which caused FDR to fully shut down all of the airmail contracts. During this time, the Army Air Corps were temporarily placed in charge of flying the mail, but they were under-equipped and unprepared, and tragically, multiple pilots died during this period. Eventually, the contracts returned with the 1934 Airmail Act. While contracts still were mainly held by larger airlines, smaller airlines received better chances of being acknowledged. This act also separated manufacturers from airlines to prevent monopoly. All this regulation was important for commercial aviation to grow, but something more symbolic was needed for public support. Charles Lindbergh was an underdog. He was an airmail pilot from St. Louis with ambition and determination. He simply decided one day that he was going to be the one to fly across the Atlantic. At the time, there was a cash prize, the Ortiz Prize, for the first to fly New York to Paris. Lindbergh talked to local businessmen to get funding, and he pushed on when everyone doubted him. See, Lindbergh was steadfast in his belief that cutting down weight in favor of fuel was most important. He refused any plane but a single engine and wouldn't be forced to ride with a co-pilot or even a radio. In the days leading up to his flight, no papers believed in him, especially in the light of deaths of pilots who had more funding and experience. All this made it even more sensational when he landed in Paris in 1927. He became an American hero overnight and made aviation truly popular and admired. With that, aviation was in the public conscience. So when the Second World War broke out, it was clear that planes and aviation would come into play. But how? World War II didn't just utilize air power, it was dominated by it. This is true from the beginning, with the Nazi blitzkrieg, but it was truly solidified during the Battle of Britain. The Germans believed that a solely air-based offensive would be enough to take the British out of the war. This was only false because the Royal Air Force, or the RAF, was able to match their power. With their advanced radar system, the RAF met Luftwaffe in the air. From the time they spotted the Germans on their radar, the RAF was able to be in the air within 5 minutes. Thanks to both the bravery of the RAF and the Nazis' invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans pulled out of Britain. One plane that was both important to this battle and an icon of World War II was the Spitfire. The Spitfire is made iconic by its unique and functional shape. The elliptical wings of the Spitfire made it impossible to mass produce, but it was worth it for the benefits. One of these benefits is very simple. The wider the wing, the more room for machine guns. You can see the Spitfire has a lot of simple benefits that stem from complex engineering. Another example is the Merlin engine. It contained a supercharger which took fuel-mixed air and pressurized it based on the plane's altitude. This was made possible by a gear change, which gave the supercharger 2 different speed settings. This important piece of technology did one thing. It maximized power no matter the altitude. Finally, the Spitfire's design provided for better lift distribution, less drag, and more structural support. These things were caused by the shape of the wings. The shape of the wings caused the aerodynamic center of the wing, called the quarter cord, to land directly on the wing spar, which is the main structural support of the wing. This also helps in creating the ideal lift, as I mentioned earlier. But the Spitfire and the Battle of Britain were only the beginning of the destruction air power could cause. When the Japanese Empire began its conquest of the Pacific, the United States responded by freezing Japanese assets. While the Japanese seemed diplomatic at the time, in reality, they were targeting the American military base at Pearl Harbor. The idea was to keep America out of the war before it even started. The Japanese targeted aircraft carriers, fuel, and planes. Unluckily for the Japanese, the American aircraft carriers were gone when the attack took place on December 7th, 1941. And instead, all they managed to do was impassion the US and get us into the war faster. One of the first things that happened in retaliation to Pearl Harbor was the Doolittle raids. In April of 1942, 16 B-25s were launched from the USS Hornet. This is remarkable because the B-25s were never meant to be launched from an aircraft carrier. With enough weight cut off them, however, it was semi-easy to do. Landing would have been another story if they got to that point. These planes were intended to bomb industrial centers in Tokyo, and while they succeeded in this, they had lost a lot of fuel since they had to take off earlier than intended, being spotted by Japanese forces. They lost all of their aircraft and 7 men, but they made a successful blow to Japanese morale and a boost to American morale. The war in the Pacific was the first time air support was used in naval battles, specifically in the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea was the first ever air-naval battle, and while it wasn't awesome for the Americans, having one sunk and one damaged aircraft carrier, it was the first time the Japanese had been stopped from achieving their objective. They were unable to take Point Moresby, New Guinea. It really turned around for the Americans, however, in the Battle of Midway, June of that same year. The Japanese had planned an invasion of Midway, but the US got a lucky break. Code breakers decoded Japanese messages and discovered where and when the Japanese would be invading. 3 carriers, including the recently damaged but speedily recovered Yorktown, gathered northeast of Midway. Ironically, Japanese forces did discover the US's preparations, but Admiral Yamamoto's strict radio silence policy made it impossible to alert him. So, American forces were able to force the Japanese to abort and damage Japanese aircraft carriers. This was considered to be the turning point of the war. By the Battle of the Philippine Sea, also called the Marianas Turkey Shoe, on June 19, 1944, American forces in the Pacific were dominant. U.S. forces were warned, again, ahead of time about Japanese plans to attack the U.S. fleet, and were prepared for that. By the end of the battle, the Japanese lost 300 planes and 2 aircraft carriers. The day after, the U.S. launched a counterattack and sank another of their carriers. The war in the Pacific redefined what a naval battle even was. D-Day did something similar as to what an invasion was. Really, air support was not that important for D-Day, but aviation did play a unique role. On the morning of, or the night before, June 6, 1944, C-47s full of men, called paratroopers, flew past enemy lines. The paratroopers were supposed to land near bridges, roads, and enemy guns. Because they were under intense fire, however, there was a lot of confusion and they didn't make their spots quite right. Anyway, they still confused the Germans and were successful to a degree. This was one of many new changes that came in World War II. World War II was the site of many new things. In 1941, segregated air units were introduced. The 132nd Fighter Group was considered one of the best fighter groups, and they lost significantly less bombers compared to other fighter squadrons. The group that brought about the most change, however, never got to see combat. This was the 477th Bombardment Group. When they were moved from Tuskegee, Alabama to Freeman Field, Indiana in 1945, they were treated terribly. The tensions were so bad on the field that the officers created 2 separate clubs, under the pretext that it was an officer club and a trainee club. In protest, the 477th slowly started going into the officers' club, getting arrested each time. At one point, 62 of the men had been arrested. On top of that, the commander of the field wrote a document explicitly separating the blacks from the whites, threatening to arrest them if they didn't sign. 101 of them were arrested, and while they were in jail, they wrote to President Truman and the Army Chief of Staff. Eventually, Truman was alerted of what happened, and the men were released, and the commander was replaced. However, this mutiny was one example of important things that were happening back home in World War II. Another thing that was happening back in America was the production of aircraft during the war. During the war, places emerged where everything was focused on industry and production for the war, such as Richmond, California, and Evansville, Indiana. These were called industry towns. Production during the war was unprecedented, as shown through the Ford factory at Willow Run, which produced a B-24 every 63 minutes. World War II was a time of change, of redefinition. Aviation became intertwined with every aspect of the war, and the war allowed production and innovation to skyrocket. The Cold War was another conflict that caused growth and innovation. Because of the intense suspicion between the Soviets and the West, there was a need for better spy aircraft. Because of this, the CIA commissioned Lockheed for the creation of the U-2. The U-2 flew regularly over the Soviet Union until 1960 and flew over China and Cuba as well. In 1962, one of these flights resulted in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Soviet missiles were spotted in Cuba. This was the only time in history that we had been that close to nuclear war. And the only reason that it stopped was because the USSR and the US were able to agree that the missiles from Cuba would be removed if the ones from Turkey were also. Another innovative spy plane designed by the same group as the U-2 was the SR-71, probably the most iconic reconnaissance aircraft of the Cold War and maybe of history. Its design allowed it to have a reduced radar signature, which made it even better than the U-2. The SR-71 was also the fastest jet aircraft in the world. It cruised at speeds greater than Mach 3. The need for speed was another example of a staple of the Cold War. The US needed to be better than the Soviet Union in every way, including speed. In 1947, the Bell X-1 achieved the first ever supersonic flight. In 1953, the F-100 Super Sabre became the first airplane capable of reaching supersonic speeds outside of a dive. One of the most iconic representations of this supersonic age was the Concorde. The Concorde was a joint project between European manufacturers, much like Airbus would eventually be. There were a few different designs for a supersonic airliner, the Boeing 2707, the Lockheed L-2000, but the Concorde was the best, and it would have been the first, if not for Soviet spies. As it was, the Tu-144 ended up being the first. It was the Soviet version of the Concorde and a clear ripoff. It took up 2 months before the Concorde in 1969. The Concorde still succeeded in being the most iconic supersonic airliner and the face of luxury in the jet age. Imagine flying on a Concorde in a time most airliners were just starting to gain their footing. And that brings me to another thing that blossomed after World War II, the jet age. Jet airliners were becoming more present because of the technological advancements made during the war. And airlines themselves were finally able to really build up and develop. One airline that had a head start in this was Pan Am. Pan Am was founded in 1927, and by 1939 it had a regular trans-Pacific and transatlantic route. Pan Am was the face of international flight in exchange for not having any domestic flights. It was also the face of the golden age of commercial aviation, with its countless flashy posters visualizing the lap of luxury. This began to fail in 1978 when airlines were deregulated and given the chance to compete naturally. By 1992, Pan Am had ceased operations. While Pan Am's time was over, commercial aviation was coming into its own, and naturally some patterns began to emerge. There are two main networks of movement in aviation, the hub and spoke model and the point-to-point model. The hub and spoke model is the more classic system, where larger planes with more people travel from one large airport to another, and then those people take smaller planes to smaller airports. The other system is the point-to-point system, which is basically what it sounds like, a whole bunch of routes going directly to each stop. Point-to-point routes have become more prevalent in low-cost carriers, like JetBlue or Spirit. It's interesting to see how these systems evolve naturally depending on the convenience of the airliner or of the consumer. Much of aviation has evolved and continued to evolve based on our current situation. Because of this, it's hard to predict what is next for aviation. There are some things that are currently significant though. One big thing is the look into new fuel sources, which makes sense because aviation is one of the biggest industries responsible for carbon emissions. One of these new fuel sources is sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, which could be made from waste, crops, or other things. There's also a move towards hydrogen-powered aircraft like this one. With all that there are technological advancements, there are still issues, such as the pilot shortage, pilot fatigue, and safety issues. 2023 was the safest year in aviation history, but there are still problems to be solved. With aviation, there will always be more to do. So now that we're almost done, I hope from this presentation you have learned more about the history of aviation and can now fully appreciate our everyday wonders. From George Cayley to the Wright brothers, all the way to the Concorde, aviation has a long and storied history to get where it is today. Remember that even if the Wright brothers thought they could never succeed, then anything is possible. Thank you. Riley.
What's your interest in aviation?
I actually have no idea. It's sort of just something that I started being interested in freshman year, and then I sort of just fell all into it. I don't know. Yes, I can't see who that is, but.
What's the point of the Concorde being like bent like that?
It has something to do with, because it's so, because the nose is usually like so straight forward and up, when the plane is taking off, they can't see as well, so they have like a system where the nose tilts down. So like, you can kind of see it in this one, but it's not usually like tilted down like that. That's just like a thing that they do when they're taking off so the pilots can actually see. Miss Elise.
Salem, when you grow up, are you going to fly the planes?
Yes, hopefully.
Which one of these planes in your presentation would you be like, that is the plane that if I could make it happen, I would want to fly in it one time just because that is amazing?
Probably the Spitfire, just because that would just be epic. Obviously it's not an airliner, but that would just kind of be awesome. Mrs. Weed.
So you talked a little bit about like the kind of the controversy of like the first in flight or whatever. So obviously you gave us lots of kind of the options. So who would you consider to be the winner? Do you think it is the Wright brothers, or you talked a lot about like the requirements of it being like controlled and sustained, so who do you think best did that?
I would definitely rule out like Carl Jacko and Gustav Whitehead and Richard William Pierce, but I don't know about like Clement Adair. I never really understood why his didn't count. Like his steam-powered engine wasn't like, it couldn't last for like super long, like it had problems, but it still flew 160 feet, which was more than the Wright brothers did, so. Mrs. Lees.
Salem, how many of your vacations have been, will be focused around the high points, pun intended, of aviation? Like, are you always like, oh, if we're going to drive from Dayton, then I've got to go here? Or, Mom, you're taking us here because of this, and everybody in the car's like, Salem.
Well, I definitely, like, if there is something about it that's like super close, like I'd like want to go there, but I wouldn't say that it's like a necessity. Mrs. Weed.
How do you feel
I think it's really like conflicting because like World War II especially, it's like all of these like extremely important innovations were made in the name of dropping bombs and like killing and all of this stuff, and it's like really unfortunate that there's a pattern of war being the thing to like make this industry grow the most, because obviously I don't think that it's a good thing that that's what a lot of like the iconic planes have like been birthed from, but it's also like so necessary for us to be where we are today.
The progression has relied on that.
Yeah.
It was just something I've never really considered until like I was listening to you like talk through these different eras, and it's like, oh dang, like that really is, what's driven a lot of this. So, so obviously throughout your entire presentation, you covered a lot of like the key players in this industry, but I don't think that you mentioned any women.
No.
So who are some of your, some of the female aviators that perhaps deserve some recognition?
I definitely wanted to talk about Amelia Earhart. I didn't think I would have enough time for the 20s. She was just like really important because she was like the first woman to fly across the Atlantic. She attempted the first like solo flight around the world, all of this stuff, and I wish I would have talked about her, but it was just like having to choose between her and Charles Lindbergh. He was the first ever to fly across the Atlantic, And I think that I'm sure there are a lot of female like pioneers that stories have probably been buried that I don't even know about. There's also, I don't remember her name, but there's a woman who was like very much in charge of like the WASPs, like it's like women air service pilots or something like that, who like tested a lot of like planes and stuff during World War II, which I think that they were very cool, but yeah, I mean, it's just, there's definitely, it's definitely a male-dominated industry, and like even like current like commercial pilots are still, there's still a higher percentage of men in that industry too, so. Mrs. Reed.
And also, it seems like this industry is very much driven by failure. So
Yes.
what do you think is like one of the most important or the biggest like failure that really drove progress?
I'd say not necessarily a failure, but something that sparked failure was like when deregulation happened for like commercial airliners or commercial airlines. It was a time where it was like, we have to let you go and let you like grow on your own, and like, yeah, a lot of things are gonna fail, but it's like important to like having like genuine growth. I also think with like the airmail like program and like having, when the Army Air Corps took over and like all of this like catastrophe happened, it sort of showed like, this is the way that we need to do things and we can't do them this way.